In today's business world, being an average CEO is no longer an option. That's why we're committed to equipping you with the resources and the tactics necessary to not just survive, but to thrive. You're listening to Not Your Average CEO Lifeline podcast, where we are more than just a voice in the crowd.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again on Not Your Average CEO Lifeline. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Becca Pearce. We are going to talk about becoming an effective leader. We have had several podcast episodes on this topic, but it is extremely important. And I believe Becca has a different perspective for you. So please take out your pens and paper and jot down notes. Becca, welcome. It is such an honor to have you. Can you tell our audience about yourself and your company and your background?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. I am super excited to be here. I have an interesting background that I think will bring to light how I ended up where I am. So I spent the majority of my career in health insurance and always climbing the corporate ladder. I was appointed by Governor O'Malley in 2011 to become the head of Obamacare in the state of Maryland. And in 2011, when I chose to accept that job, we had no legislation. I had no staff. I didn't have a computer. I didn't have a place to sit. And in less than 2 years, we were going to fundamentally change the way healthcare was delivered in the state of Maryland. And I did it anyway. So I took that job. I could not have worked harder, believed more in what we were doing. And in 2013, it didn't turn on the way it was supposed to turn on. So, you know, a $350 million IT implementation sometimes doesn't go the way it's supposed to, didn't actually turn on. And I lost my job quite publicly several months later. And there are times that I truly believe that accountability and responsibility are in the same place. And I get it. I lost my job publicly. Fortunately, I landed on my feet, which is strange for women. A lot of times when women fall off, they disappear forever. It's called not the glass ceiling, but the glass cliff. Fortunately, I was able to land on my feet. I landed back in the healthcare arena in a Medicare MCO, which is a Medicare and Medicaid health insurer. And several years later, it was about a year and a half later, I was talking to my daughter at the time, and I said, you know, you can't talk into mommy's bad ear. You know, you need to talk into mommy's good ear. And a friend of mine said, you know, single-sided deafness is not normal. So long story short, I went in for a hearing exam, came out finding out I had a brain tumor the size of a golf ball, and I needed surgery imminently. The time between diagnosis and surgery was 5 weeks. During that time, I put my life in order, right? I didn't know if I was going to come off the table. The good news, it was benign and operable, the two most important things you can hear when you hear the word brain tumor. And it's still a really big deal. It took me a long time. I spent most of the year learning to walk again. I am mostly blind in my left eye. I'm completely deaf in my left ear. My face was paralyzed for a year. It was as if I had a stroke. My entire left side was weak. All that recovery, it took me about 6 months to get back to work. So at that point, I was within a hospital system. I was vice president within a hospital system. It took me about 6 months to get back to work and to prove to myself that I could do the job again. I had to prove to myself that I could do the job again. And about the time that I figured out I could do it again, I also went, what am I doing? Why would I want to be doing this? All I want to do is put my daughter on the bus one more day. At that point, she was, you know, 8 and a half. I mean, all I could think about was that I wanted to put her on the bus. And so after investing in myself and really taking a close look at who I was and who I wanted to be, I left the corporate world to start an executive coaching and consulting firm. And now work with high-performing executives and business owners who are usually stuck somewhere, most often in the day-to-day, and can't figure out how to get out of that day-to-day. And together we help them think bigger and think differently so they can change the world the way that they wanted to when they started the business.
Thank you for sharing.
That's really an amazing story. I think Nicole and I are both moms, and so I think we can really resonate, with how you were feeling and how that must have felt and how you wanted to move forward. I think that's an amazing story, Nicole. I'm sure you feel the same.
I definitely feel the same.
It's one of the few times I've actually said it without crying. So
you said it. You said it without crying, and you did a great job at explaining your story. So now here you are as a coach and a consultant. Our topic today is leadership. So I, being even in your roles prior, have gained all this experience. My first question is, I think our audience needs to hear what the difference is between someone who leads and someone who manages, right? There can be this gray area, but to succeed, I believe you need to know the difference. And I'm pretty sure you feel the same.
Yes, absolutely. And it's such a, right. I mean, if we looked up synonyms, they might be on the same page, but they absolutely, in my mind, are not the same. And I think as you think about the corporate world, there's a reason that there's leadership training or management training and leadership development, right? So there's just a different phase. What I see as a manager is very focused on the task. What is the work that needs to be done? How can I solve the problem for you? How can I make it easier for you to do that? When I think about a leader, for me, a leader is leading through influence and inspiration, right? Bigger picture, helping people see how they fit in the bigger picture, getting people to come behind you and want to do the work in a different way. A manager is very transactional in my mind, and a leader is really pulling people along with you.
I think that's a really good distinction. I think it's something that, I've been doing this now for almost 20 years, and I haven't thought of that, that there is a distinction and that it's important. So I'm really happy that you shared that. I know that in some of your work, you talk about being free from some of the day-to-day minutia, and how that can really increase your effectiveness as a leader. So can you talk a little bit about that, about the steps to do that? I think that would be really helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of interesting, especially as business owners. The one thing that I see is people forget to promote themselves. Because when you start your business and it's just you are emptying the trash cans, you're answering the phone, you're paying the bills, you're doing absolutely everything there is. As your company grows, people forget that they don't need to do that job anymore. So the number one thing, and it's sort of counterintuitive, that you can do to get out of the minutia is stop doing what you were doing. Stop doing what got you here, right? All of those things that are easy. You have the neural pathways that are like, okay, but I can pay the bills and it's easy and it's soothing. I don't care. The first thing that you can do to get, that's you stuck. The first thing you can do is mentally promote yourself into the role that you're in and stop doing what got you to where you are now.
That makes a lot of sense. So there's that pivotal moment when you have to, just sort of paraphrasing what you're saying, sort of consciously say, like, I'm stopping this, I'm starting this. This is the time that I'm going to change.
Yeah, I work with a lot of people too, to just an easy tool for yourself and for your listeners to be able to, is to create a list of all of the things that you do and star the things that only you can do. Those are the things that you start recognizing, okay, well, I should be able to delegate, or I want to be able to delegate this. And that also is actually really important. I just said a word that is a really bad word in my language, should, right? Don't should yourself into it just because you think, oh, well, I would do everything. I would never ask them to do anything that I wouldn't do. Again, okay, I get that you would empty the trash cans. But imagine being the employee looking at you and going, why is she emptying the trash cans? That doesn't make any sense, right? So allowing yourself that list allows you to look at it and say, okay, the number one thing as a CEO is to drive the future of the business. Is emptying this trash can right now going to drive the future of the business, or is having somebody else's job be that, so that I can free up the 15 minutes it takes me to walk around the 5 offices to do that, the more important thing for me to do? So interesting tool.
For our listeners, Becca, that are afraid to give that up, right? They may be afraid to truly lead. I think they need to know, or I shouldn't say I think, they need to know what their leadership style is and to lean into that, right? My leadership style is completely different than Danielle's leadership style. And I've had to hone in on my strong suits, right? So how do our listeners identify their leadership style, and then how can they use that to motivate their team and improve their team?
That's a really good question. The interesting thing is, as business owners and entrepreneurs, a lot of times people don't see themselves as the business owner or the leader. I'm just the insert whatever you want into business for, right? And the first number one thing that you can do is to start believing that and talking about yourself as the leader. I'm the leader of this organization, and give yourself the title and step into that. But then understanding exactly what your leadership style is, there's a little bit of having to look in the mirror, right? There's a little bit of like, okay, what am I good at? What am I not good at? Now, here's the other problem. The interesting thing is, for business owners, even though they're risky enough to actually take the chance to open the business or start the entrepreneurial experience, there's often, that overused term of imposter syndrome, right? So we've all got those voices. So I think it's when somebody says to me, like, I feel like I don't belong here. My response is, well, do you? Ask yourself, right? We give so much credence to those voices, and often they're wrong. They don't need to be right. So listen to the voices, because normally the voices are trying to keep you safe. And whatever they're telling you, say, okay, that's not actually true. I am a really good listener. Like, identify the things that you bring to the table. Now, Daniel Goleman defines there are 6 different types of leadership, and we could get into a whole thing about that. But then prior to that, I think it's important to just understand, what is it that I do well? I'm really good at inspiring other people, because what you really want to be able to do is focus on inspiring and bringing them along with you. And the number one thing that you can do to do that is help your people understand how they fit in the bigger picture. They're not just coming in and putting the nail in the, in the board, right? They fit in the bigger picture. And especially for service-based industries, helping them understand, their customer service is driving the future and the culture of the business. So how is it that you kind of pull all of those together? It's understanding that there are multiple pieces that you bring to the table, and tapping into the ones that are your strengths and focusing on those strengths as much as possible. And then identifying, if you say, okay, I sometimes can be really tough on people. Okay, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that's why you're good at what you do. That's not an asset. What is it that you want to change? So focus on your strengths, identify the places that you could be doing better. And by the way, your spouse or somebody else might be able to tell you some of those things if your employees aren't ready to tell you. But focus on your strengths, identify some of the places that you could focus differently, and go from there.
I'm trying to process my next question, because I don't want to skip ahead just yet. I want to take a minute to go back.
Mm-hmm.
Now I've identified my strengths. Maybe I know employees, like you said, they can be a little skeptical to give their honest opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So asking around, I've identified my strengths. How am I going to take that strength and improve my team, improve my company culture, and lead while leaning into those strengths that I've just identified?
So I will back up just for a minute on the Daniel Goleman style. So he has essentially created the framework for effective leadership, and you can look him up. It's Goleman. And there are times that you lean into different pieces. So he talks about coercive, which is essentially command and control, which is really good in crisis. He talks about authoritative, which is not authoritarian, but authoritative, which is helping people tie themselves into the bigger picture. That's really good in uncertainty. When people are unsure about how things are going to move forward, you want to tap into that piece. The third one he talks about is pace setting. There are times, and this is focused on expecting excellence and demanding. So this works well when you have, if you think about entrepreneurs and they've got a development team that's got to hit a deadline, and they are super productive and they are really effective at their jobs, that might be a good place to tap into that. But outside of that, it's limiting and can be destructive. So that's not one we want to lean into too often. Affiliative is building bonds. And we talk a lot about culture. And the number one thing I believe that culture eats strategy for lunch. I stole that from somebody else. But but it's true. The culture defines what you're going to achieve in your organization. So this management style is building that camaraderie, building that community within the organization. Also really good when you're building the culture, but you can get that overboard, right? That can, if you're not focusing on results and you're only focusing on the community and the camaraderie, that can be too much. The fifth one he talks about is democratic. And he talks about leading through consensus. I personally don't believe 100% in consensus, but I do believe in giving your team the ability to speak up. This is really good when you, as a leader, I'm going to back up for 1 second. As a leader, I have a belief that you should never have all of the answers. And it is really powerful for you to look at a team and say, I don't know that answer. I need your input. And that is democratic leadership, to be able to show that vulnerability, admit that you don't exactly know what the answer is, and to get buy-in from people. Now, the number one thing you need to do when you use that leadership is actually use the feedback that you're getting. And the sixth piece he talks about is coaching, which is really developing people for the future on an individual basis. And so a good leader can identify what's needed at the moment. So to go back to your question, Nicole, I've identified my strengths. How do I use that to motivate the team? It's you being able to read the room and saying, okay, they're in uncertainty right now. What can I do for them? Or we really need to focus. We've got to hit this deadline. How can I push them to actually get the deadline done? Like understanding that different scenarios require different pieces of you and being able to pull out those pieces at any given time. There's not one single answer.
I'm glad I took a minute to think about what I wanted to say, because that was a perfect explanation of it. Danielle, do you have any other questions for Becca before I ask her about being a CEO and not your average CEO?
Yeah, I mean, just the information you shared is terrific, and we'll include some of those references in the show notes as well for folks. But I'd love to hear, just about if someone is listening to this blog post today as it comes out, and they are, wondering what kind of changes that they could make today. So we talked about figuring out, what tasks you have to be the only one to do, and moving on from the rest of them. Are there any other sort of perspective shifts or things that you can think of that would be actionable steps for our listeners to be able to take?
Absolutely. So I coach a lot of people who have recently started a business, recently started a tech company. And what I say to them often is, you were really good at your old job, whatever it was. I coach a lot of doctors who are now doing tech startups, things like that. You were amazing at your job. When's the last time that you got coaching on leading yourself? The relationship that you have with yourself when you start a business, when you're a small business owner, is completely different than the relationship you had with yourself when you worked for another company. The shift here that I think is so important is giving yourself the grace to understand that it's okay that you're going to manage yourself differently than you did before. Let me give you an example. So, corporate America for a long time, I was even, in state government, all of those things. I always had a boss, right? Whether even when I was CEO, I reported to a board, right? So you always technically have a boss. When you go into business for yourself, you don't really have a boss, right? Like it's you. And all of a sudden, I was sure that I was going to be this person that got everything done within like days, right? I'm a strategy person, and it took me 3 months to do my strategy when I opened my own business. I would have fired myself when I did that, right? Until I recognized that I have a different relationship. I'm going to need to lean on different motivators for myself than I did before. So that's really important, I think, for people to recognize that they may be pushing themselves in a paradigm that they used before that may not be working for them or their team. And so really recognizing what works for their organization, I think, is a huge mind shift. The second thing that I think is really important for people to understand once they finally step into that top role is you have way more influence than you realize. You just asking a simple question, depending on how big your organization is, could be an entire project in one department that you have no idea is going on, right? All you did was ask a question. Well, what if we insert whatever it is? All of a sudden you got 2 or 3 people running down some rabbit hole that you really was just asking a question about, right? So recognizing that you have a lot more power and a lot more influence, and being very clear about your language with your team is really important. I'm truly just asking right now, what if we did this? Don't do anything with it. I'm just, asking a question. And the other thing that I think is the way you see yourself may not be the way your team sees you. So when you do get that feedback, Nicole, on your leadership style, heed it. Look in the mirror. Take the time to recognize that it took a lot of guts for them to say something in the first place. So it must mean something. So those are the mind shifts that I think are really important.
I agree. I definitely agree. And that was very helpful. I think a lot of our listeners need to hear it, even if you think you may know it, right? And we talked about not being the smartest person in the room or not knowing everything. Sometimes you need to hear it as a refresher.
Right.
So as a CEO now, what would be one piece of advice that you could give to another CEO listening?
Your job is no longer to do the work. Your job is to create the space for others to do the work. I can't tell you how many times I'm working with small business owners of dollar businesses who still think it's still their job to do the work. Your job is to create the space for others to be successessful.
Danielle and I understand that, right? In the business of talking to small business owners and business owners, telling them to delegate, right? To use a virtual assistant. We preach that all the time, and how much time it can free up and what growth can happen when you actually do let go. So I love that piece of advice that you gave.
One of the things I actually like to say to people is you either have an assistant or you are an assistant, right? So find an assistant. So
I like that one. Danielle, would you agree?
Yes.
Our last question, Becca, as always, is what does not an average CEO mean to you?
So I think it's, for me, leadership has shifted over the last several years, and it shifted even more through COVID, where people are begging for relationship and connection. So to me, not your average CEO is more than focused on the job getting done. More than the average CEO is focused on the people and recognizing that focusing on your people leads to better results financially. I mean, there's a lot of data out there to show that. And so it's focusing on the culture, leaning into your people, being that type of leader as opposed to a command and control, which, by the way, a lot of us learned. A lot of us learned under command and control, right? I mean, that was the Jack Welch way, right? This was what it was supposed to be. But leaning into the new leadership style and focusing on your people is what's going to make a difference.
Very wise words. I think our audience will really appreciate that.
Can you tell our audience where they can find more about you? And of course, we will include it in the show notes, but we'd like them to hear it directly from you.
That's great. Yeah. So I'm actually not in all that many places. I'm 52, so that's probably why. But I am on LinkedIn under Becca Pearce. So just go out on LinkedIn and look for me under Becca Pearce. I do have a website, www.extendcoach.com. And we do a fair amount of, I do a fair number of retreats and things like that. So always look out there to see what retreats I have coming up too.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Becca. It has been a pleasure hearing from you.
It was so fun spending time with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Becca.
You've been listening to Not Your Average CEO Lifeline with your hosts Danielle Cuomo, CEO, and Nicole Glitchio, Els, COO. This podcast has been sponsored by Virtual Assist USA. If you'd like to know more about the hosts or exploring virtual assistant services, visit virtualassistusa.com for more information.